lived for a while, Bleecker Street here in Greenwich Village. Yesterday we were at the Greenwich House Music School where he taught for a number of years. It's during this was a period 1944 to 53, about there, when he lived here in Greenwich Village. First here on Bleecker Street and then over on at 150 Prince Street. So during this period, his closest friend was John Cage, and of course Cage became very well connected with all of the Greenwich Village's abstract expressionist artists of the period, and it was a very heady musical and artistic atmosphere when Harrison arrived here in Greenwich Village. Cage introduced him not only to all of these modern musicians, but also to choreographers, artists, writers, and thinkers. Some of their earliest friends were and collaborators were the choreographer Jean Erdman and her husband, the famous writer and mythologist Joseph Campbell. And they used to meet together all the time. I began looking at this background in Greenwich Village as a way to preface what my submission for this conference was about Lou Harrison's freestyle, more specifically his symphony in freestyle, this 1955 radical work that I'll talk about. But it ended up being much more about the whole intellectual background to that piece and these other pieces, his first just intonation pieces of the 1950s. So I thought I'll get to the symphony in freestyle, but and I know Jim will be talking more about freestyle, but I thought I would talk a little bit about the whole intellectual background that prefaced these ideas. So here, Lou and Cage were meeting with Joseph Campbell and others. Campbell suggested they were talking very much about South Asian philosophy, and Campbell suggested that they read this book called The Transformation of Nature and Art by Ananda Kumaraswamy. Kumaraswamy was a scholar colleague of Campbell's over at Boston Museum of Fine Arts. So Kumaraswamy argued that since the Renaissance, the art of the West has represented only superficial reflections of individual egos tainted and manipulated by base commercialism, rather than art inseparable from life, guided through cultural tradition to reflect a higher spiritual reality. Kumaraswamy felt that, on the other hand, that Asian art and medieval European art was, quote, ideal in the mathematical sense, like nature, not in appearance but in operation. Of course, Cage would later frequently paraphrase this quote, which is itself a paraphrase of Thomas Aquinas, as art is the imitation of nature in her manner of operation. So Kumaraswamy in this book shows that Asian art frequently manifests this, quote, ideal in the mathematical sense in its use of standard canons of proportions, which Kumaraswamy calls generically tala, which of course is the same word used for the organization of meter in South Asian music. So Harrison and Cage experimented a lot with creating works with such disinterested mathematical structures in New York in the 1940s, and I think right now a famous example of this is being performed, or was just performed, is sonatas and interludes, which Cage claimed to be reflective of this Kumaraswamy idea that he writes about called rasa. And these pieces are all put together by strict little sections of rhythmic proportions, time, integer time proportions, and Harrison did some of that too, and became very fascinated with Kumaraswamy, and even wrote him a letter, and Kumaraswamy graciously replied and gave him a list of books to read. A different and maybe more surprising source for this, for Harrison's philosophy of composition, came from this book by Thomas Mann, of course, the German expatriate novelist then living in Los Angeles. The English translation of his novel, Dr. Faustus, appeared in 1948, became a sensation within the music community, of course, for its depiction of a composer who gradually abandons his soul and humanity as he descends into syphilitic madness. At one point, this composer character, Adrian Leverkun, explains, take Brahms as an example of how subjectivity, so to speak, creates the unity of the work anew at every moment. Take Brahms as an example of how subjectivity turns into objectivity. In him, music abstains from all conventional flourishes, formulas, and residua, and, so to speak, creates the unity of the work anew at every moment out of freedom. But precisely on that account, freedom becomes the principle of an all-around economy that leaves in the music nothing casual and develops the utmost diversity while adhering to identical material. Where there is nothing unthematic left, nothing which could not show itself to derive from the same basic material, then one can no longer speak of a free style. Leverkun then suggests a maximum integration of a series of theme, or what he calls a fundamental musical word. Words of 12 letters, certain combinations and interrelations of the 12 semitones, series of notes from which a piece and all the movements of a work must strictly derive. Every note of the whole composition, both melody and harmony, would have to show its relation to this fixed fundamental series. Not one might recur until all the other notes have sounded, and not one might appear which did not fulfill its function in the whole structure. This would no longer be a free note, and that is what I would call strict composition. When describing these technical aspects of music, of course, Thomas Mann had to call in an outside expert, so he wrote his friend who was living just down the road in Los Angeles, Theodore Adorno. And Adorno had just completed this manuscript on Schoenberg and sent it to him, to Mann. Adorno later came to somewhat regret this gesture, as his article, which was largely meant as a defense of Schoenberg, provided Mann with this metaphor for the paradox of how absolute freedom can create absolute predetermination. And I thought about that, this paradox of freedom and predetermination at one of the previous presentations. Of course, Mann's other neighbor in Los Angeles, Arnold Schoenberg, was enraged to see his creation being plagiarized by Mann's evil character. Maybe you have read the anecdote in Alex Ross's book of Schoenberg confronting Martha Feuchtwanger in a Brentwood grocery store, yelling, I never had syphilis. But Harrison took from this passage a distinction that fit many of his own thoughts about composition at the time. Harrison just wrote his own book called About Carl Ruggles, and cast his analyses of Ruggles' works in the context of his own preoccupations. Here are some photos from this period. There aren't too many, but this is what he looked like back then. Harrison proposed perennial tension in the history of music between the superficiality of fashion, largely due to the degradation of the composer in a capitalist society, and the richness and profundity of music of self-consistent personal reflection. The chief characteristic that Harrison recognized in this latter type of music that he called total polyphony, a type of music in which, quote, each voice is a real melody, bounded to a community of singing lines, living a life of its own with regard to phrasing and breathing, sustaining a responsible independence in the whole polyphonic life. And as you can tell from this description, such polyphony became for Harrison a very powerful metaphor for society and the role of a composer in it. This thoroughly self-consistent approach to musical materials, what Kumaraswamy called the delight in rules and what Mann called the strict style, carried over to Harrison's and Cage's experiments with musical form. When Harrison began sketching out the first movement of his Symphony on G in 1947, he worked out the form ahead of time and lined all the measures on the score before he started filling in the notes. So the first movement, for example, consists of 6 sections of exactly 32 and a half measures each, plus a short coda, set in sonata form. So 2 of those 32 and a half measure segments are the first and second theme, then 2 are the development and 2 the recapitulation. Pieces like this reflect the spirit, if not the exact explication of strict style from Mann's novel, in which Mann called it a sort of astronomical regularity through rational organization. 2 of Harrison's most strict Ruggles-like compositions from this period were the atonal Alleluia for strings and motet for the Day of Ascension. But uncharacteristically for Harrison, he worked so hard trying to match this ideal of concentrated consistency of total polyphony, he ended up hating and discarding those works. Of course, this was part of his struggle compositionally, but also mentally at the time. As was the case, very frequently he would become so enraged at a piece, an atonal chromatic piece that he was writing, he would discard it and then just start writing something just using the white notes. And so in 1951, he began sketching out a Kyrie Mass entirely in a pentatonic mode, consisting of 9 sections, each section consisting of 9 phrases, and each phrase lasting exactly 9 half notes. A scheme that reflects the 3-time repetition of the Kyrie, and the 3 parts of the Mass movement. When he explained all this construction to Cage laughed and called it his Mass of the Straight and Narrow Path. Harrison noted that by this time he'd reached a crisis in his composition, just as he was reaching a crisis in his mental stability and personal life. And he saw that this kind of whipsawing between atonal chromaticism and strict diatonicism, or even something pentatonic like this, was a reflection of that struggle. He called it a squirrel cage, and because he would just go around and around in this with these kind of symptoms, he attributed this dissatisfaction finally to his lack of understanding of the acoustical basis of music. He found his way out through the next book I would like to mention, which, of course, I think is more familiar to people here. This is a book that he was handed by Virgil Thompson in 1949 because Thompson had received a review copy at the Herald Tribune and just gave it to Harrison because he knew his interests in this area. I should mention that Harrison was not ignorant of alternatives to 12-tone equal temperament, because his teacher, Henry Cowell, had written about, and this is, this comes really from his teacher, Charles Seeger, and from his teachers, essentially from Riemann and all of those German musicologists who were trying to create a scientific basis for musical harmony, and so fixed on the harmonic series and the subharmonic series. And Lou even tried as a high school student applying this in quarter tones. And then he also knew of historical tunings from his work in the early music ensemble back in San Francisco. But also in San Francisco back in the 1930s, he first heard Harry Partch's music on the radio, Harry singing the Lee Ho songs. Didn't know what to make of it, and next came across Harry when he reviewed the concert that John mentioned in 1944, sponsored by the League of Composers here in New York. He was mostly unsympathetic. He didn't know what to make of it, really, as I think a lot of people, their first encounter with Partch would sympathize with. But once he read this book, he found it outlines this philosophical and acoustic background, but also talks about the role of composers in society, the relationship of voice to music, and all of these things that really interested him at the time. It brought together the Kumaraswamy's description of nature's manner of operation with Manon Adorno's strict integration at all levels of the composition. After reading the Genesis, Harrison said he bought a tuning hammer and started to tune his old upright piano to 3 twos, to pure Pythagorean intonation. And he'd been using 5th or 4th based counterpoint and was astonished by the difference that it really made to the sound of his music. he was frustrated because in one of these apartments here he couldn't practice late at night without waking up all of his neighbors, so he built himself a little clavichord of his own design and started messing with the tunings with that. His interest in tuning and South Asian philosophy also converged in the next book I'd like to call your attention to. Alain Daniellou's Introduction to the Study of Musical Scales. Danielou was a French ethnomusicologist living in India who became a dedicated advocate of what he called modal music, meaning for him entirely melodic music, usually with drones, developed out of the expressive possibilities of musical scales. His advocacy of monophony recalls not only Partch's early focus on the human voice, but also Cage's disdain for harmony of the period. And although Harrison during this period did not disavow harmony like Cage did, many of his works were often, during this period, he experimented with single melodies or single melodies with drones. And idealized the independent beauty of each melody, and even in total polyphony. Just like he advocated for an ideal society that recognized the beauty of each of its diverse individual constituents. But like Partch, Danielou advocated just intonation and justified the emotional power of this music through the mathematical representation of nature. Although both agreed that European capitulation to equal temperament led to a debasement of the arts as a superficial entertainment rather than in its humanizing role reflected in and this is Joseph Campbell's language, mythic narrative. To Danielou, the mathematics of justly tuned scales were symbols of a cosmic metaphysic, ultimately, as with Plato and other ancient writers, a reflection of the eternal divine. He wrote, "All music is based on the relations between sounds, and a careful study of the numbers by which these relations are ruled brings us immediately to the almost forgotten science of numerical symbolism. Numbers correspond to abstract principles, and their application to physical reality follows absolute and inescapable laws. In musical experience, we are brought to direct contact with these principles. The connection between physical reality and metaphysical principles can be felt in music as nowhere else." During this period when Harrison was struggling not only with these questions, but his own fragile mental state, he took refuge often in mystical Christianity, a preoccupation which is evident in many of the titles of his pieces during that time. So in Kumaraswamy, we may be tempted to associate his views of the timelessness of proportions with Plato's ideal forms, and indeed Danielou does some of that. But Kumaraswamy explicitly rejects this interpretation along with its mystical interpretation of the power of number. He said, "But whereas Platonic types are types of being external to the conditioned universe and thought of as absolutes reflected in phenomena, Indian types are those of sentient activity or functional utility conceivable only in a contingent world." Although Harrison became fascinated with the long history of Pythagorean influence on European thought, this is a distinction worth emphasizing. Numbers may or may not have some kind of independent existence as absolute form, but to Harrison, their use in music is justified not by some kind of mystical symbolism. Instead, we find meaning and attraction to whole number relationships, Harrison thought, because it's a place where psychology, physics, and aesthetics converge. Likewise, Partch interpreted these intervals not as symbols of the cosmos like Danielou, but as real empirical experiences whose expressive potential lies in their objective effects on human listeners. as Harrison's psyche began to heal in the early 1950s, he moved from mysticism, away from mysticism, and away from the noisy city to the serene countryside, first in Black Mountain College, then back to California. Once in the Bay Area, he met Harry Parch again, and the two began their long friendship, and often spending many a late night discussing tuning and aesthetics in Parch's studio, then in Sausalito. In 1955, Harrison received a commission from the Louisville Orchestra and brought out his maths of the straight and narrow path that as Cage had called it, the pentatonic Kyrie. But he no longer felt that connection to the spirituality of number, or at least in a sense of praising Christian God. So he replaced the text with a text of his own that, instead of praising God, praises the holiness of various aspects of nature. The repetition of the Kyrie is replaced with the repetition of the line, "Here is holiness." But most crucially, Harrison replaced the equal-tempered orchestra with one playing in 5-limit just intonation in this scale that you see here. And he appropriated Thomas Mann's term by calling the collection strict songs. So these were the first major composition, apart from the serenade that John played last night. The first major composition conceived in just intonation. Here, the strict style refers not just to the tuning, but also to the rigid mathematical approach. You can see 9 half notes times 9 times 9, and to the poetic text. Mann's text contrasted this strict. Well, let's look at that just briefly for those who might not be familiar with this piece. So this is the first movement. There are 3 others that feature different pentatonic modes, all again in just intonation. And here's this first movement. The just intonation orchestra is very similar to the one described for the piano concerto earlier. So with trombones, strings, and percussion. Of course, the contrasting approach, according to Mann, is this freestyle, and so just a few years before this, Harrison had supervised one of his first recordings for a commercial label, his Suite for Strings No. 2, which was recorded by a string quartet, and it really hit him at that time how string players will adjust their tuning to on the fly to be in tune with each other, and so he thought of another possibility that he called freestyle, which in the music primer he said it is to freely assemble or compose with whatever intervals one feels that he needs as he goes along. This is freestyle. And Parch, when he discussed it with Parch said it made him dizzy. But this is the piece. It's in two copies of the score. This he wrote it out on this in this parchment in different colored inks. But there's another one that he wrote for reproduction in Oslin. I'm sorry if you can't see this very well, but here's a closer view of it. The intervals between each successive notes in the different melodic lines of polyphony are each specified by ratios, so that they are the note heads are put closest to the closest note that they would appear in the staff, but instead of being in the context of a fixed scale like the strict songs, there is no fixed scale. Everything is determined according to the immediate context and what is needed. So, as you can imagine, this here's a oops. Sorry about that. This is rather difficult, especially in a pre-computer age, to try to realize. What he ultimately came up with was an orchestra of viols with tied-on frets at different places. But even so, each player would need to have between 4 and 6 viols and place one down, pick up another one to get all the pitches. Another book that he was attracted to, that he and Parch were discussing at the time, was Kathleen Schlesinger's The Greek Alves, and she talks about how you can construct your own Alves with different tunings by boring finger holes at different places. And he thought that just at that time, these inexpensive plastic recorders were showing up in music stores. And so he went so far as to write to one of the manufacturers to see if he could buy a bunch of plastic recorders without the finger holes so that he could bore his own. And got very angry when they declined. But even so, each flute player would have to have several of these flutes in order to get all of these notes. So it was never realized until David Doty, Harrison's friend in California, made a version of it in 1992 with Lou's assistance. It sounds like this. I was never very satisfied with it, and I did my own version of it. Unfortunately, it was just at the time. I just finished it just after he passed away in 2003. I did it with C-Sound computer music language and samples of the instruments. So this is what it sounds like. So notice this looks like a scale, but those intervals between the steps are getting gradually larger. 10, 9, 9, 8, 8, 7, 7, 6, and so forth. And that whole thing is transposed here. And actually, he does make a mistake, a mathematical mistake later on in the piece, but I won't go much further into it. Maybe we can talk later. I know that time is running out, but I wanted to mention, as some have, Giacomo mentioned in Larry Polanski's music, the influence of this idea of freestyle, which seems before computers kind of outlandishly impractical, but actually can be available to people now. Larry called it paratactical tuning, which borrows a term from linguistics, in which a type of expression that is not tied to an overall context, but in which meaning comes from this succession of words without connections. If we have a few minutes...
We have 6 minutes. We already entered the question time.
Okay. Well, yeah, I have a video or piece of my own that uses this, but let's start with questions, please. Yeah.
What's the connection between Ben Jonson is constantly referring to everything? It's paratactical, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Think of his string quartets.
Yeah, but also I think of Ben's string quartets as having that connection to the 1-1, however distant. You know, he might be up at the 27th harmonic sometimes, but
it's still in the lattice. And
yes,
he is not letitial.
Right. You know, there's at a point that becomes moot. You know, if you get too far away. Certainly, you know, Toby Twining's Requiem goes so far out that it might as well be
freestyle.
Freestyle, yeah.
Good, thank you.
Any more questions? And by the way, thank you so much for giving so many new aspects and very different from Lou Harrison's context of creativity. And you were mentioning, I think, the piece 251 was premiered at La Mama Galleria. Is it the one very near here? I think it's 3rd or 4th Street, could it be? Because I saw it. It's a theater, experimental theater place.
I've never been.
Was it there? Do you know?
Was which 25?
The Lamont Theater.
Yeah. Yes. Was in New York.
Sure.
Okay, so it's
Couple of
5
blocks
minutes
over.
from here, or less. Yeah. Okay. I was just curious. The name, the same name. Yeah.
Well, Lou had many premieres here in Greenwich Village, like at the Cherry Lane Theater and other places.
Mm-hmm.
Please.
Just the last question. Do you think that it is more practical to notate the ratios of the intervals when you compose in freestyle than the ratio of the absolute pitch?
Well, Lou kind of thought so, but as you heard in the Tomb of Charles Ives, if you don't pay attention to it or give the players some kind of reference, sometimes it becomes difficult on a practical level. Lou often said, what they should be teaching in music schools is for violinists to be able to feel the difference between a 9/8 and a 10/9, or to be able to sing that difference. And he referred to it as a successive difference. But I think if you gave this to musicians just and asked them to play 7/6/8/7 and 12/11 and all of these different things here, that I think they'd be quickly lost. And that's part of the reason why all of these are fixed pitch instruments. So they're all pre-tuned. I know that Johnny Reinhardt did a version in which that was not the case, and I don't think that that's successful. Yeah.
Well, two other ideas. First of all, he didn't carry on with this. This was pretty isolated, right? I mean, there's but how many other pieces?
Well, there's the Tomb of Charles Ives. There is the recitatives from Political Primer, and there is the introduction to Nova Odo.
Oh, okay.
Those are all freestyle.
And to be practical at this point, would it not be, if someone was going to be fascinated to perform this, to do it by translating it, like the tune, like he did with his version of here it is, and all deviations from equal temperament. That way people could at least play it without freaking out.
In the Political Primer recitatives, for example, he just said, this is the way it will be if you sing it correctly, and I'm not. He wasn't trying to impose it in that case, but in a case like this, you would have to figure out all of these absolute ratios, like I've done here, in order to bore your finger holes or whatever.
So
tie on your
barbershop quartets are freestyle or strict style?
Yeah, well, it's often called adaptive just intonation now, but it's the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think the big difference is Lou is often not using intervals that are that easy to tune by ear.
That's
in these
right.
pieces, there's no glorious, seventh chord that everybody lands on. It's more these. It's more, to me, is trying to show where you can go with it, right? And transcending the sort of I'm writing a piece of 8 notes.
Well, this was a period when he felt he had the space intellectually and personally in his life to be very experimental and to try out different things. And his first 3 major just intonation pieces each took a very different approach. The strict songs, then this, and then the incidental music for Sina, which is not modal like the strict songs. It's much more chromatic, but it's a fixed scale.
But But Robson also used this accidental in comparison to previous intervals, especially the string quartets that actually was played by different string instruments. So you end up, I don't know, kind of 2 minutes later in a comma difference, and they just had to tune by ear. I don't know, I mean, Kronos Quartet could possibly do it. I don't think that anybody else.
Jack.
Huh?
Jack Quartet. And the Kepler.
Okay.
Yeah,
And one of the
Maybe
Keplers
they'll
is
solve
one of my
it.
colleagues. So
Okay.
we can talk.
I think that naturally happens with, professional musicians. But you're right. If you ask them to do 7/6/6/5/5/4 and 11/10/10/9, that's not something that they're immediately going to fall into. So he wanted pre-tuned pitches for this piece.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to present Jim Dalton. He's an American composer and performer. He has been professor of music theory at the Boston Conservatory at Berkeley since 2000. Dalton's compositions have been performed throughout the United States, Canada, and Europe by the Transient Canvas, Kalis Volsis, Sharon Leventhal, Stephen Alto, Paul Ayres, Aaron Lazier Kaplan, Donald Baustit, and Carson Kuhlman, and at such venues as the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., the Kansas Symposium of New Music, Musique Nouvelle in Lunel, France, Euro Microfest, Sound Festival of New Music in Scotland, and Académie der Tonkunst in Darmstadt, Germany. As a music theorist, as well as a composer, Dalton's interests and research have ranged from palindromes and symmetrical musical structures to jazz intonation and microtonality. He has presented at conferences in the United States and abroad, including the Society for Ethnomusicology, the Society for American Music, Beyond the Semitone in Aberdeen, Scotland, the 17th International Music Theory Conference in Vilnius, Lithuania, and the Nova Contemporary Music Meeting in 2018 in Lisbon, Portugal. And Microtonal Small is Beautiful in 2021 and 23. Please welcome Mr. Jim Dalton.
So we've actually already discussed two of the three complete pieces in freestyle by Lou Harrison, and I'm the lucky one that gets to play the entire piece all the way through, not by any of my own agency, but the fact that the piece is only 38 seconds long. So, A Phrase for Arion's Leap was published in 1975, and I find this piece to be really interesting, both in some ways as an outlier, and in other ways as being really, really representative of a lot of very important ideas in Lou Harrison's creative life. Probably the best thing to do would be to listen to it first. There is the score. The score was first published in Zen Harmonicon 3 in 1975. It's appeared a number of other places, including in the Journal of the Just Intonation Network in 2001. And the one recording of it was 1986 on a Telus cassette. The performance was by Harrison with Richard D., who was one of Harrison's students and friends, and William Colvig, Harrison's partner. So here it is. teaching this, by the way, to my own students back home because I can play the piece every time we discuss some other aspect of it. You know, just play the whole thing once more. So, little background. In an interview with David Doty in the... no, I'm sorry, this isn't from the interview. This is from his talk at the, Microfest in 2001. He gives the story of Arian. Arian had the permission of his king employer to take part in a music festival and contest. He won the contest and was returning on a vessel that proved to be of pirates. They took his money. He asked for the right to sing one final song, which was granted. So he dressed ceremonially and sang. At the end of his performance, he leapt overboard and was carried to shore by the music-loving dolphins who had gathered to hear him. Later at court, the pirates reported that he had died, and at that moment, Arian came out from behind the throne. So, a little picture of Arian playing his lyre and riding on the dolphin. As I said, 38 seconds long, and during that 38 seconds, there are 50 pitched sounds. I'm going to come back to the intervals in a moment. Or actually, I should do it in that order. There are 50 different pitched sounds on the score. But because Harrison gives from one interval to the next in freestyle, as Bill described earlier, we should note that there are 19 intervals. And although there are 18 nominal pitch classes, by that I mean the name of the pitch, D, E flat, etc., there are actually 28 distinct intonations. So 28 actual pitches, though they have 18 names on the score. So as I said before, this is in some ways an outlier, and in other ways it's very representative. The things I mentioned before are part of what makes it an outlier. Again, there were only a handful of pieces that he wrote in freestyle. So, you know, already that makes it not representative of his overall output. But the very brevity, I'm sure there are many other short pieces by him. I don't know whether this is the shortest, but it is certainly among the shortest. But here are some things that, if you know any of Harrison's other music, you know that these are, especially during that particular period, in the 60s and 70s and after, a lot of interest in non-Western instruments, especially Asian, and instruments he built with his partner, Bill Colvig, that they designed together, or he designed or came up with the idea, and Colvig executed for him. A strong connection with and respect for ancient musical thought. Super particular intervals, or epimoric if you'd rather have the Greek than the Latin. Tetrachordal divisions and clear tonal centers. Now the clear tonal center, I guess, could be argued a little bit, but very often it was. And we'll address each one of those things. So on that particular score, he calls for 3 yachengs. I've given you the other more current spellings there. And it's a bowed zither. So these are open strings that could be tuned to the appropriate pitches and then just played with the bow. There are 3 in the score. There are 2 harps in the score. One of them is labeled troubadour harp, and the other is wire strung harp. This is a wire strung harp. I'm not sure if it's the same one, but this is a harp of the design that he had executed with Bill Colby. Tetrachords. So the tetrachord, as most of you know, is the division of a perfect fourth or a 4/3 into different intervals. And this is John Chalmers' book on the subject. It's a fascinating time, right around 75. Evidently, Chalmers was nearing the form, or nearing the completion of the material anyway for this. The publication didn't happen for many years after that, but evidently Harrison had been in contact with Chalmers and knew this material well and had a box of papers that represent at least an early version of the book. And they talk about this in the forward. Actually, Harrison wrote the forward for the book. I point out that, Larry Polanski mentioned that Harrison already had this by 75. Here's a passage from Harrison's forward. He said he was talking about having been to an ethnomusicology conference, and he said, however, a little later, Mr. Colvig began to build extremely accurate monochords on which we could study anything at all, and we rushed in a kind of ecstasy to try everything at once. Bill and I designed and built a transfer harp, which I believe was the instrument we saw, wire strung with 2 tuning systems, both gross and fine. Although innocently and quickly designed and built, its form we discovered is that of what the Chinese call a standing harp. The plate is parallel to the strings. We already owned a Lion and Healy troubadour harp, and with these, and with the addition of one or two other incidental instruments, a bowed psaltery, which we saw earlier, drones and small percussion, Richard D. and I, in one rapturous weekend, tuned and recorded improvisations in a fair number of the modes from planetary history, especially from the classical civilizations and Islam. And he goes on. But I wanted to read that because he essentially describes the ensemble that we're dealing with in this piece. Transfer harp, troubadour harp, bowed psaltery, and percussion. So let's look at some of the tetrachords that appear in it. The very first few notes of the piece are these intervals here, which, if you know your different forms of the tetrachords from the Greeks, the diatonic, the chromatic, and the enharmonic, you recognize this right away. The enharmonic has a major third in it and 2 quarter tones. So your 40, 39, and the 26, 25, although not the same size, not an equal tempered quarter tone, but those are significantly smaller than a semitone, and that's what would have been considered a quarter tone. That particular form of the enharmonic was described by Ibn Sina, who's most often known as Avicenna in his Latin form of his name. Now, that tetrachord connects as a conjunct tetrachord. In other words, the last note of this tetrachord becomes the first note of the next tetrachord of the piece, which is that the chromatic tetrachord of Didymus from the 1st century BCE. Chromatic tetrachord has a minor third, 6/5, and 2 semitones. This actually ends up being one of the most significant sets of intervals in the entire piece. Then we come to something else. We come to the concept of permutation of the intervals within tetrachords. And that idea is often attributed to Al-Farabi. And in fact, Harrison, in an article that he wrote that was in Zen Harmonicon 4 in 1975 still, the year that Phrase for Arian's Leap was composed, this article was entitled Item, 5-tone, 6-tone, and 7-tone modal forms within the traditional matrix of two tetrachords separated by a 9/8. And what he talks about there is the fact that the Arabic theorists would take the order of the intervals within the tetrachords and put them through the various permutations. So again, the idea attributed to Al-Farabi, but Safi al-Din started systematically doing this. In other words, when he listed his tetrachords, he would list them in all the permutations. And what Harrison did in that article was come up with all the different permutation orders for 5-tone, 6-tone, and 7-tone modes. By doing this, he would take the traditional framework, which is two perfect chords connected by a 9/8. And then he would, just using letters to show this. So S for small, M for medium, L for large, and E for equal. And went through all the possible permutations that could occur within those for 5, 6, or 7-tone scales. Again, in the same year that the piece was composed. And when we look at the score again, you'll see this. You have, at the beginning, as I said, you have that enharmonic tetrachord, conjunct tetrachord that connects, last note of that one being the first note of the chromatic tetrachord in the metal strung harp, which appears at the beginning and the end of the piece. But then it also occurs, if you remember, the Achengs have a chord that they play and they move to different pitch levels or different intervals, and they are moved at a permutation of that same chromatic tetrachord. And in the following section of the piece, when you have the troubadour harp, you have intervals that look like they're not really as much related to the other intervals in the piece that I'll talk about in a moment. But it is the tuning of it, actually, the two tetrachords of the troubadour harp tuning are yet another permutation of the chromatic tetrachord. So we have medium, small, large for the metal strung harp, small, medium, large for the Achengs, small, large, medium for the troubadour harp. And then super particular or epimoric ratios. Those are ratios that take the form of the numerator being exactly 1 unit larger than the denominator. Or, sorry, that should not say equal, that should say x plus 1. I had a little proofreading issue here. X plus 1 over x. Right. And Harrison's interest in this actually traces to Ptolemy, who wrote his harmonics in the 2nd century of the Common Era. And I've got a couple of quotes from Harrison about this. This is from the interview with David Doty in 1987. He says, "I found that I'm getting to be like Claudius Ptolemy. I have to have an interlocked series of super particular ratios. There's no getting around it. I'm unhappy if I don't." And then later in the interview, he's talking about his statement, just intonation is the best intonation. And he said that it offends people who don't want everything to be subjective. And then he goes on, but I'm like Ptolemy. I even think they should be super particular too, and chained super particular ratios are the ideal ones. And around the same time, he realizing that he had those interests, he was working on types of slendro tunings for his gamelons, and used super particular ratios for that as well. So he would divide, or he would use for the first intervals an 8/7 and a 7/6, and I forget which order. But I think it might. You probably know. Did he do it in both orders? One of them on one gamelon and one on the other, if I recall.
No, they were the same in the two.
They were both the same.
Yeah.
Was the
7/6 was first.
Okay, so it was 7/6, 8/7, and he would have the 7/6 and 8/7 again later, but he would connect them with a 9/8. He says you can introduce a 9/8, so it's all super particular, which is what I like. Here are all the intervals. Now, you probably can't see that. I know it's small. But I'm going to point out a few. Most of them are clearly super particular or epimoric, however you want to say that. I usually tend towards epimoric for whatever reason. 13, 12, 8, 7, etc. But then down here I have some asterisk in orange. 5/3 is really just an inversion of the 6/5. 15/8 is an inversion of 16/15, and 48/25 is an inversion of 25/24. So those are easily, still related to super particular. But then you have the two that I asterisked in purple, 128/75 and 32/25. Actually, this is an interesting thing. It says 96/75 in the score, and I was wondering why, and I could not find a really good idea, good reasoning for that, any kind of justification for it whatsoever. And I was rereading some of Harrison's other material, and in one of them he says, I think it was this. Yeah, it was in the address to the Microtonal Festival. He said, "There's a mistaken interval designation somewhere in the piece, but I've forgotten where it is." So evidently he just didn't reduce it. It's not 96/75, it's 32/25, still not super particular, but when you rearrange all of the intervals that are in the troubadour harp melody, you see that it is those two, that third permutation of the chromatic tetrachord. And it's an equal tetrachordal scale connected by a 9/8, so it's that traditional matrix of having the two tetrachords connected by a 9/8 whole set. So, and then going on, this explains a few of the other things. Duple division of the tetrachord. This is something that he discusses in yet another place where he's talking about, he had written an article called Blessed Are the Translators, for They Give Us Worlds. I think that's the full title of it. And he's talking about the fact that he was reading a translation of Boethius, and that Boethius took most of his information from Ptolemy, and there was one passage, one section that was titled "How Ptolemy Divided the Diatessaron into two parts." And he said that, the way Ptolemy would do that would be with super particular ratios, so the only three possibilities for that are those. And the chord that is in the yachengs, the three yachengs, although it moves in that permutation of the chromatic tetrachord that I mentioned, they're spaced in 8/7 and 7/6. So that's what the chord is in 8/7 and 7/6 tetrachord. It spans a fourth, but it's divided into those two intervals. And then, interestingly, too, the only other two notes that I couldn't explain as being part of one of the tetrachords happened right after the completion of the yacheng phrase, where the metal strum harp descends from D down to B, a 7/6, and does that by the epimoric ratios or superparticular ratios 13/12 and 14/13. So everything comes from this kind of superparticular ratio. Every single piece, every single pitch, and every single interval in the piece can be related to a superparticular interval, and either a division of the tetrachord or a further division of some of those intervals. So that's the set of pitches now. We're talking after Bill's presentation about whether it's easier for the performers to have it in the intervals between pitches, or whether to know what the pitches are. If we were to sort out what the pitches are, this is what I've come up with. Now, Larry Polanski did a similar kind of thing at some point a number of years ago. He started from the first pitch of the piece as 1/1 and figured out what all of the intervals were from that point. And I took a slightly different approach. Of course, either one of our approaches gives you insight into a different aspect of the piece. So what I did was I determined that I felt that D was the tonal center, so I made everything in relationship to D. And I did that by this means here. Number of iterations of each pitch. The one that had the most iterations by far was D. The one that had the second number of iterations was A, which is the dominant of D, and acoustically gives the D more importance. It's the longest duration in the piece by far. It appears in the most different octaves. The opening conjunct tetrachords lead to D, and at the end you have kind of a truncated form of that same opening, but missing the 5/4. It's the only thing that's different, but that leads from D. All of the widest leaps are either to or from D. And in the yacheng tetrachord, the lowest of the three instruments leads up to D in the tetrachord, and the highest one starts on D and leads up to D. So this is my analysis of it. What I've got here is Harrison's original ratios that show the intervals between pitches written above. I know you can't read it because I can't read it from here, actually, but I'd be happy to share this with anybody who is interested. And then below, I have the ratios that name the pitches from the D as 1/1, so we're starting on a 9/8 E. And again, everything is related to those tetrachords. I'll just go through them once more before we listen to it again. We start out with the two conjunct tetrachords meeting on A here, which he had indicated as A440, starting on E330. Okay, so there's the two conjunct tetrachords leading up to D. We ornament the D, and then we have octaves in the troubadour harp and the beginning of the Chang phrase, which the highest pitch starts on D. That moves by a permutation of this chromatic tetrachord up to here, and then it comes down by a 25-24, a chromatic semitone. Then the troubadour harp is, if we put them in scale order, it's that other permutation of the chromatic tetrachord. Here is that division of the 7/6 into a 13/12 and a 14/13. And then we have those long leaps, the wide leaps. And then here we have the beginning of the enharmonic tetrachord, and then we have the chromatic tetrachord, and we end a tritone away from the D with a trill. And some percussion, which he has listed as a deep tam-tam and sweet jangles. I'll be happy to share that too.
Thank you so much, Jim. Well, fantastic. Wow. Any questions, please? I'm sure I was not writing any questions because there are so many Luha research specialists. I thought I will let them talk.
They may know all of this already.
I think this is illuminating, answering those questions about which is helpful in terms of notation. And the answer is obviously both. You want both. You want to know. And I think as a performer, I may prefer successive ratios because they orient you without having to know what the hell 256 over 243 is. But then as an analyst, right, when you look at it, it's like, oh, these are the relationship. Yes, that's what we are.
I'm sorry, Giacomo, maybe because Jacob just left, maybe it depends on the instrument, because you play a polyphonic instrument, he doesn't. So maybe that's why I have the feeling he prefers the numbers instead of the ratios. I don't know if it has anything
Well, I was
to do.
thinking between the successive ratios versus absolute.
Okay.
I would put sense on everything just for also objective kind of reference. But there's like study score versus performance score in a way almost. Right?
Yeah, I definitely do that with my compositions. Working with Sharon Leventhal a couple of years ago. I used the Mort-Sabat notation. And Sharon, having done all of the Ben Johnston string quartets, prefers to have things in Johnston notation, but she said, but if you put in the ratio, if you put in the sense, then I'm totally fine. So,
Okay.
Some of those absolute ratios can get
very big and unwieldy, so it would make sense for, who knows what, 20,048.
Yeah. If Johnny Reinhardt was here, I would be very interested in his opinion, actually. Because he has, I have witnessed he has such a mind. So I don't know.
I don't want to channel Johnny, but
you know him well.
There are a couple of things I could predict. One is that he sees a lot of, or he's had lots of success with just the sense deviation, and and he's used that a lot, and I perfectly understand that. Mm. The other is that he, at least recently, tends to put things in 128. His 128.
At the end perception, what we've been talking about these days, your mind rules actually, so you will have this tendency to bring it to your own system of perceiving the sounds. Yeah.
I can verify that too. Johnny told me once that I think it was for one of the Lou Harrison pieces, the way he managed it was to put it into 128, and then the people that he uses were able to read it.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.